Welcome to Real Mob Stories with James Proctor. Today we're going to talk about a few different topics that are going on in the genre, starting off with the legacy of John Gotti, 22 years after his death. We also have John Gotti Jr. going on with Berner this week that I want to say a few words about. Also, wanted to share with you a happy birthday to America's oldest gangster and touch a little bit on the Gambino bust that took place last week on Staten Island. I'll conclude today's show with a story I've been researching regarding Tommy Reynolds. I know that a few other shows have been talking about Tommy and his mother, Mary Ann, but there were a few things I found out about my research that I think you guys might find interesting. And so just wanted to share that with you and hope it might piece things together just a little bit. With that said, please hit the like button and consider subscribing to Real Mob Stories with James Proctor. Without further delay, on to our feature presentation. 22 years ago today, John Gotti Sr. passed away at the Federal Prison Hospital in Springfield, Missouri. He had spent the last 11 years locked up and ended up succumbing to cancer. And when you look back at John Gotti and his legacy, it's definitely complicated. And for me, I see three different personas of John Gotti. I actually did a short video earlier about John Gotti, which talks about his legacy. And so I wanted to play that for you. John Gotti passed away 22 years ago when this video was being made. And what's his true legacy? When answering that question, where do you actually start? You have John Gotti the gangster, but you also have John Gotti the pop culture icon and John Gotti the family man. In the 1980s, people were captivated by the Dapper Don, and the news media and government had him all over newspapers and television. John Gotti had a charm about him, and people were captivated about how this guy was an underworld figure that kept on beating the government trial after trial. The Gotti name is one that even today is a revered name in hip-hop culture, with hundreds of songs and artists using it. John Gotti wasn't the first high-profile public gangster and won't be the last, but what set John Gotti apart was that in the 1980s, American media was mostly television and newspapers, and Gotti was treated as this celebrity gangster, which intrigued Americans. You'll never have another John Gotti because times have changed. Gotti took over at the end of the golden age of the mob. The government figured out how to put gangsters away for life through the use of RICO and informants. John Gotti will always be remembered. Okay, so growing up in the 80s, I remember vividly, the John Gotti trials, seeing him all over the newscasts of the day and in the newspapers. I didn't really know much about the mob part of his career until later on in life. And he always personified the gangster life, and he obviously loved being a gangster. He was loyal to his cast of friends that surrounded him. And, as far as his personality, he could be both humorous and cruel at the same time. John Gotti was moody and wasn't always easy to be around. The way he took over from Paul Castellano was brazen, and that hit in front of Sparks Steakhouse might be the most infamous hit of all time. I was watching MIkey Scars and RJ talk about how John Gotti wanted to be the boss of bosses in New York. And that's actually intriguing to me. We knew about how the Chin and John Gotti had a poor relationship. And I always said that the takeout of Frank DeChico was the biggest blow for John Gotti. If Frank DeChico had lived, we wouldn't have had Sammy Gravano, in such a high position with the family. And Frank was well respected, and John Gotti actually listened to him when given advice. And so for me, it would have been interesting how John Gotti would have fared if Frank DeChico hadn't been taken out. But, the truth is that John Gotti would have ended up in prison. There was no way around it. He was target number one for the U.S. government, and they weren't going to stop until he was behind bars for life. But back to what MIkey Scars said, I think it's probably true that John Gotti wanted to be the main boss in New York. When you look at how he meddled into the affairs of the other families, I think he did that because he needed allies to combat the influence of Chin. And if you look at the way the commission was set up in 1986, the Bonanos weren't on the commission. They had gotten kicked off, back in the, late 70s, early 80s, due to the Donnie Brasco fiasco. And so the way that New York was set up at the time, you had the Lacases and Genovese aligned against the Gambino family. And the Colombo family, even in the 80s, they were in disarray. Carmine Persco was in prison, and they were a wild card. And John Gotti did not like Carmine Persico. He felt that Carmine did a disservice by defending himself in the commission trial. And so John Gotti actually, called Carmine a rat. Also, John Gotti was trying to get the Bonanno family back onto the commission. He was friends with Joe Massino. And so he knew that if he had the Bonanno family back with Joe Massino as their boss, that, they would support Gotti. Regarding the Colombos, John Gotti was supporting the Vic Arena faction. And if he could have gotten Vic Arena in as the official boss, that would have given Gotti control of the commission. You also had Gotti influencing things with the Jersey family. And as you know, the Jersey family, the DeCavalcantes, they actually had a crew in Manhattan and a crew in Brooklyn besides what they had in New Jersey. And it was Gotti who put in John D'Amato as boss of the DeCavalcante family because John Riggi was in prison. And there was a rival actually for the DeCavalcantes, Corky Vastola. That was someone John Gotti was in prison with, and he didn't like him. The influence with Gotti onto the DeCavalcante family was so much that he actually required the reinduction of several of those guys into the family because they weren't properly inducted, with a gun, knife, and card of a saint. The DeCavalcantes were using props and playing cards, and that angered Gotti. And, I understand why they did it because, the worst thing or the last thing you would want is to, get, some sort of raid and during the induction ceremony. And then you also had the whole Philly War going on after Nicky Scarfo went to prison. Scarfo wanted to hang on, but the commission wouldn't have it. And John Gotti was pushing for John Stampa. And unfortunately for Stampa, he was an outsider. And it just wasn't going to work, in South Philly. But that was the guy Gotti wanted. And then finally, you had the Patriarca family up in New England. It was Gotti who said Raymond Patriarca Jr. that the Gambinos would not support him. And he had a choice. He could resign as boss or be killed. So Gotti had this big influence on what was going on with the other crime families. And it was also that he could actually take control of the commission from the Genovese family in Chin. And then regarding the celebrity gangster and hip hop culture, people will say that Gotti ruined the mob, but my opinion is it was already going downhill. Obviously, I don't think a boss should be out in the public like John Gotti was, but at the end of the day, that didn't cause the mob to fall. All of that was already in progress with the Joe Bonanno book, RICO. The government finally understood how they could use RICO to bring these guys down. And then you had all these informants. The informants were more afraid of the U.S. government than they were of the mob taking them out. However, Gotti's a lasting image on American culture, especially the hip hop culture. Hundreds of songs, hundreds of artists have used John Gotti in their music. Something that's overlooked by a few people is the John Gotti as a family man. Gotti had two brothers in that life. Gene Gotti, he was very capable. And I think if he hadn't went to prison, he could have went a long ways in the family. I mean, that's easier said than done because, I think it wouldn't have mattered. He would have ended up being in prison anyway. But, he went through 3 trials, 2 mistrials, and then he finally got convicted. I believe it was in 88. And he had originally got arrested back in 83. So it's like 6 years before they were able to put Gene Gotti away. But, I think he would have been a more capable boss than Peter Gotti. But, Peter was in there for several years after Gotti went to prison. And then you had his son, John Gotti Jr. But the Gotti name continues today with the grandson. You got John Gotti III. You had the Floyd Mayweather fight and how that's, a big name fight. The promoters with Floyd Mayweather were taking advantage of that Gotti name. So even though John Gotti's gone, his name continues through his children and grandchildren. And so what do you think of John Gotti's legacy? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Berner announced that the first John Gotti Jr. podcast episode will be coming out on June 12th at 3 p.m. Eastern. My understanding is that it's going to be explosive. I did a poll a week or so ago asking folks if they planned on tuning into the podcast, and it was something like 70% said yes. I've had questions on why Junior Gotti is doing this podcast with Berner, and the truth is that he really could have had this podcast with just about anybody. I was told that Vlad TV had reached out to John Gotti Jr. on a couple occasions and told him to just name his price, and that Vlad would pretty much pay anything to have an interview with Junior, and Junior Gotti refused. Regarding Berner and Gotti, they go back several years, and Berner is actually very successful. He's a multimillionaire, and he gained his wealth from his pot brand called Cookies. And from my understanding, it's the largest pot brand out there. And, I don't partake in any of that, and I don't even drink, but, I know a lot of people do. And he's also a hip hop artist. And that's where he had got in contact first with Junior Gotti a few years ago. My understanding is they hit it off really well. And Junior Gotti actually gave Berner some of the recordings of John Gotti, and they were used in Berner's Gotti album. And I actually listened to it, and you do hear John Gotti speaking, on 4 or 5 different songs within that album. I suspect the turnout for this episode is going to be massive. My understanding is that's not a one-time podcast. It's going to be done on a regular basis, but I'm not sure the details yet on how frequent it'll be. We've also been told that John Gotti III will be doing his rematch with Floyd Mayweather Jr. on August 24th, and it's going to be in Mexico City. And when I heard that, I thought, wow, this is a curious choice. I knew originally they wanted to do it in Las Vegas during Super Bowl weekend, and something didn't work out on that. But, when I look at Mexico City, my first thought is wow, the altitude is just really high. I mean, that's at, I was looking online earlier, and the altitude in Mexico City is over 7,400 feet, and that's over 2,000 feet higher than Denver. Both boxers will have to adjust to the altitude. I wonder if Floyd Mayweather's doing this on purpose, as we know that Gotti the third is a power puncher, and he's going to have to pace himself to avoid tiring out. It's going to be an exhibition like the first match. Honestly, I didn't think that Mayweather's camp did a good job promoting the first match, and I'm not sure why, but because of the controversy at the end of the match, I think this one's going to do well. And also, depending on the location they pick in Mexico City, they can have a really big turnout. I know that they've had NFL games, they've had other sports events there, and I know the Azteca Stadium or whatever, it can hold way over 100,000 people. So it's going to be interesting where they're going to do this match in Mexico City. So we'll just see. My only thought is that it's a curious choice, and it's going to require both boxers to alter their strategy. Moving on, we're going to talk about an interesting guy named Mario Fiore. Mario's an OG, and he's the oldest living gangster. Mario's out of Springfield, Massachusetts, and he turned 100 years old a couple of weeks back. And they've had a couple of nice birthday parties for Mario. And I actually spoke with Mario, and he's really a true gentleman. And there was a short that I did on Mario Fiore, and I encourage you guys to take a look. But I just wanted to say happy birthday, Mario. Next, you've had several gangsters that have gotten out of prison the past few months, and there's been a lot of speculation regarding these guys going back into the life. And my personal opinion is I just don't see it happening. I know a couple of people recently have said that Gene Gotti's still active, but again, I don't see it. I don't think he's going to jeopardize his freedom, to get back into this life, which, it's just not what it once was. We also had Joey Testa and Anthony Center that got out of prison. And again, I just do not see those guys going back into the life. Even other ones, Joe Watts, he came He got out a couple of years ago, and there's a few others, and I just don't see any of these guys actually going back into the life. And so finally, before we get to Tommy Reynolds, I just wanted to talk a little bit about this Gambino bust that happened this week. It was first reported by Jeff Nadeau of the Sit Down. In summary, 19 people got arrested, including several guys allegedly with the Gambino family. Eddie LaForte and several of his immediate family were arrested, plus others were arrested for running an online gambling site. They were also charged with gambling, loan sharking. There's also a separate indictment around mortgage fraud. And so when you look at the government's case, they're saying, oh, this is a criminal enterprise. And in my opinion, it's not much of a story, but anytime that the feds can say organized crime or mafia or La Cosa Nostra, they're going to push it to the public. And of course, the media will run with it. And so here's a short video I did on the latest updates of this Gambino bust. So I just want to play this for you.
This week, we had a bust of several people allegedly involved with the Gambino crime family on Staten Island. 19 individuals were charged on 80 charges of gambling and loan sharking that's being portrayed by the state as a criminal enterprise. Edward LaForte is being portrayed as the main target on this investigation. Here are a few updates. Matthew Maury, who I interviewed on the show with Lee last year, is one of the defense attorneys. According to Mr. Maury, the so-called criminal enterprise charge is an overreach and is at worst an illegal gambling operation. Maury also said these so-called victims all love Eddie LaForte. No one was smacked, no one was threatened, and no one was hollered at. All the guys that got arrested got bail, and the next hearing is set for August 14th. In addition, this story is not new, as the search warrants took place last May, and the indictments had been sealed for over a year. When you look at the indictments, which you can download from my community page, it's really pretty minor compared to what you typically see with these type of cases. Please subscribe to Real Mob Stories with James Proctor to get the latest updates related to this case.
That's all I wanted to talk to you about regarding, the Gambino bust. Once we get more information, I'll let you know. Like I said, there'll be a court case, I believe August 14th. So, I'm sure we'll get some more information then. So now on to the Tommy Reynolds story. I know a lot of people is going to say, James, this story's been played out. And I agree with that. But, there's a lot of people that just don't know the facts on this. I'm hearing a lot of stuff the past week on what's going on. And I think that what I'm seeing is that things are getting taken out of context. And before we get started on this, I just want to say that the whole thing was tragic. The thing that happened with Judy Shimtoff, I mean, unforgivable. There's no justification at all. Put any of these guys that, what they did was evil. And, I believe that, they'll pay for it. The point is that I just want to clear up some of the misconceptions on what happened. I've got some interesting information that expands on this New York Post article talking about Mary Ann Reynolds. I think you're going to be able to see a more complete picture of why she reacted that way and what was going on. Okay, so this thing with Mary Ann Reynolds. So, Mary Ann, is Tommy's mother. She had a tough time dealing with what was going on with her son. She didn't really believe it at first about the Shimtoff murder. She actually said to the lady, Cesaris Ingrid, at one of the pretrial hearings that these boys are innocent just because they grew up together. They're being blamed for everything that went wrong on Staten Island. The Shimtoffs obviously devastated. They didn't know what had happened to their mother. They had no clue, and now they realize, it was a robbery that went bad. And, everyone's on a heightened emotional state. Mary Ann insisted that Tommy was a different man than this murderous aspiring mobster he was in his younger days. She talks about the 6-year-old daughter, how he wanted to go home to be with her while he still had life in him. And what really started all this, so we hear what happened with the New York Post, but this actually happened earlier. That's what kind of started all of this. So Mary Ann Reynolds had bumped into Judy Shimtoff's daughter, April, in the courtroom's hallway. She didn't know what to say to April. Marianne was basically staring at April. April saying, well, what the heck is this? April staring back and eventually said, you have the nerve to look at me. Marianne reaches out to put a hand on April's shoulders and begins to say she was sorry. But before she could open her mouth, April flung her hand away and screamed, don't put your hand on me. Your son killed my mother. There's no forgiveness here. Taken back, Marianne cursed under her breath and left. And she says he hadn't been convicted yet. Just remember that. So later on, Marianne said that he may have admitted to being a killer, but the drugs had made him do it. And they was sorry. And so was she. And April screamed back, you deserve the son you got. The argument continued, and then Tommy Reynolds' uncle, who was also named Tommy, yelled to the Shimtoffs, and then cops came out. He's saying, hey, you're all a bunch of jerk-offs. That's right, jerk-offs. Now, who wants to do something about it? Law enforcement intervenes and escorts the Shimtoff family to their car, and then the other daughter, Arlen, says, I want these people to know what they did. I want them all to admit what they did. Tommy Reynolds ends up pleading guilty. And the thing he said on the stand is, this isn't a happy day for anybody. I'm really sorry for what my actions have caused people, especially the families who were not involved in this life. So remember that 2 of the 4 people he was involved with murders, they were innocent. They weren't part of that life. I think where a lot of the outbursts then in the courtroom happened, Tommy had talked with the prosecutors, and originally it was said, well, if you plead out, it'll be good for you. And so the thought is that he would get something less than a life sentence. But, if it went to trial, then, the prosecution was looking for a life sentence. Ended up happening is that Tommy did make the plea. But then when Judge Corman said the sentence, he said, you're sentenced to life. And so Marianne began to wail, no, my son. It was just an uncontrollable grief, and she was escorted out. That sentence was originally a life bid, and they thought that by pleading out that he would have gotten something less than that. Then you hear what Marianne said in the Post. You have rats that got 6 years. She was an emotional wreck. It was nothing more, nothing less. So Judge Corman accepted the appeal, and they went ahead and changed the sentence from life to 36 years. And I believe Tommy Reynolds has also gotten a couple of years shaved off of that. But, when I look with the Bureau of Prisons, currently Tommy Reynolds is scheduled to be released in 2030. So anyway, that's the story there. I just wanted to bridge some of the gaps because, we only had the one part in the Post, and there were other pieces of this that happened that was not identified in the article. And so again, I'm not taking up for Marianne or Tommy. It was an emotionally charged situation, and there was more to it. And the mom and everyone on Tommy Reynolds' side was upset because they were thinking that they would get a lighter sentence than the life. And, inevitably it did happen. So that's all I wanted to share with you. So thank you for watching the show. Please like and subscribe to Real Mob Stories with James Proctor. And I hope everyone has a great week. Take care, stay safe, and God bless you always.